Hello and welcome to American Friction, the US politics podcast that needs no introduction. But practically it does, so this is it. And I need no introduction also, but I kind of do. I'm Jacob Jarvis, and carrying on with the introductions, joining me today is of course Nikki McCann Ramirez. Hi Nikki.
Hi Jarv.
And our guest today is Noah Bullock, Executive Director of Cristosal, a leading human rights organisation that has represented victims and the families of those displaced and disappeared in Central America for more than 20 years. Noah, thank you very much for joining us today.
It's a pleasure. Thanks for having me.
For this episode, we wanted to speak to Nikki about a piece she had written with the headline, "The Judicial Black Hole of El Salvador's Prisons is a Warning for Americans." And then it goes on that President Nayib Bukele used a crackdown against criminals as cover to erode institutions and destroy civil rights. The parallels to Trump are undeniable. Nikki, the Venezuelans sent to El Salvador, what do we know of their sort of fate at the moment? The whole thing is clearly wrong. But how many do we know at the moment that were sent in error?
Yeah, so I'll start by saying that Noah and I had a wonderful conversation for that piece. We talked for over an hour about the situation in El Salvador, about the prison system, what Americans are getting wrong about the state of exemption and, what Bukele is doing. And the phrase that really stuck out to me and why we stuck it in the headline was this concept of a judicial black hole. We don't really know what the state and condition of the over 200 Venezuelans and Salvadorans who were sent by the United States to Bukele's prison system is right now. We are slowly learning a little more about their identities, where they were picked up, what justification the government used to deport them. But the reality is we do not at this time have a ton of access to these prisoners. We know there are lawyers working on getting them out, but at the same time, you have the US government fighting tooth and nail to keep them imprisoned in a foreign country without even a semblance of due process. Because of a 60 Minutes report that came out over the weekend, we now know that between 60 and 70% of the people that 60 Minutes were able to identify have no criminal record and no criminal convictions. That is the overwhelming majority of the people who were deported to El Salvador by the Trump administration. The Trump administration itself has only admitted that they wrongfully deported one person, and that would be Kilmar Abrego Garcia, a man from Maryland who had an order protecting him from removal because he had fled El Salvador due to threats from the gangs. A judge in 2019 granted him protection from removal. He was married to an American citizen, is married to an American citizen. He was deported through what the government called like an administrative error. The reality is that while they're saying that this one man was mistakenly deported, all of these deportations are unlawful. And we'll talk a little bit about the Supreme Court ruling that came out on Monday in a bit. But the violations of due process rights here inherently make these deportations mistaken, unlawful, whatever you want to call them. But the reality on the ground, which I really want Noah to dive into this for us, is that even if you have all the proof in the world that these people should not be imprisoned in El Salvador, you have both a system that lends itself to abuse and a government running it that is wholly uncooperative with the notion that these people should be let go.
On that, with the judge's order that you mentioned there, is the assumption basically that Trump will just completely ignore this?
Essentially, well, I'm going to say tacitly, yes. They are fighting tooth and nail to get any sort of intervention from the courts overturned, overruled, struck down. They have repeatedly told the courts when the courts say, hey, you have to bring Abrego Garcia back. The deadline was actually midnight yesterday, and then the Supreme Court intervened and said, actually, we're going to wait. We're going to, give us some time to figure this out. He stays in jail. They have essentially told the courts multiple times, like, go talk to the government of El Salvador. We don't have jurisdiction. And it's a bogus notion because at the end of the day, the United States is paying the government of El Salvador, is paying Bukele millions of dollars. They have inked out a pen and paper deal to hold these prisoners. The notion that the U.S. government cannot say, hey, Nayib, I need this guy back, or I need these people back, it's completely bogus. They have a deal. But at the end of the day, the core function of that deal is for the US government to expropriate the rule of law to Bukele. It is to pay Bukele to say, when someone comes and tells you, hey, this court or this international human rights organizations say you're mistreating these people and you need to send them back, I am paying you to tell them to fuck off. That's what the state of the system is right now.
No, with the system in El Salvador, could you describe to me I'm sure it's hard to know these specific prisoners, what their conditions are like, but more broadly, what are prison conditions like in El Salvador? What can we know the fate of some of these people is?
Sure. Yeah. I think just one thing that Nikki was mentioning is this idea that, like who's responsible for these people. And the day or the morning, basically, that they were reporting these deportations, the president of El Salvador, Bukele, tweeted in response to the court order, oops. So sort of thumbing his nose at the court, right? Like there was a court order that was supposed to stop the deportation flight, and he says, oops. But yeah, the situation in El Salvador in the prisons is, our organization has been monitoring what in El Salvador we call a state of exception. So the state of exception is like an emergency declaration that the government put into place to combat gang violence in response to like a weekend where over 80 people were killed. And this sort of outbreak of violence is pretty well understood as part of the agreement that Bukele had with the gangs during the first 3 years of his administration. He basically negotiated with the gangs to create the perception of improved security in exchange for political support of the gangs and benefits to them in prisons and things like that. So there was this outburst of violence, and in response, Bukele orders the legislature to create this emergency decree. This suspends due process rights. And that alters not only the criminal justice system in El Salvador, but the situation in the prisons. Because at that point, there were about 38,000 people in prisons in El Salvador, which was one of the higher incarceration rates in the world. Today, now there are 120,000 people in prison. That's 2% of the population. And that's because under the state of exception, soldiers and police, really at their discretion, began to round up people in communities, mostly poor communities. And 85,000 Salvadorans have been detained without previous investigations, without judicial warrants. And they've been held in maximum security prisons, in theory awaiting trial, like pretrial detention. But while they're in those prisons, all of the prisons, including the Secot, the mega prison that's been so widely publicized, that nobody has access to them, not their families, not their lawyers. They're in a situation essentially of forced disappearances. Family members don't know if their relatives are dead or alive. Many have been in prison now for 3 years awaiting trial, and our organization has documented systematic practices of torture in the prisons, intentional denial of access to food, water, clothing, hygiene, medical attention for people with chronic illnesses. And that combined with physical abuse has produced at least hundreds of killings. Our organization, as of this moment, has confirmed 369 killings. The most recent one was just last week, a 24-year-old man who died supposedly of kidney failure. But it's pretty unheard of for somebody to die at that age of kidney failure when the families had no knowledge of them having kidney failure entering the prison. Usually what we've noticed in documenting these cases is that people, their internal organs are damaged as a consequence of beatings. So they'll die of things like kidney failure very quickly. Or people even have died of starvation because their stomachs have been destroyed as a consequence of beatings. So in a sense, when President Trump accepts this offer made by Nayib Bukele to house deportees and Naib also offered even U.S. citizens convicted of crimes. He's offering the services of a prison system in which massive and systematic violations of human rights are happening. And I think that the other important part of that is to understand that these abuses in El Salvador are happening without any judicial oversight. Part of what's gone on in El Salvador has been sort of an authoritarian capture of state institutions over the course of the last 6 years. And so the courts in El Salvador were overthrown by President Bukele's supermajority in the legislature in 2002. The Attorney General was overthrown. They installed loyalists. And so there's a justice system that is unable to protect the rights of people and obeys really the desires of the president. And so that's sort of when Nikki talks about a judicial black hole, that's precisely what we're talking about.
When it comes to this deal between Bukele and Trump, is there anything other than money in it for Nayib Bukele?
The money's not very much. $6 million, in 2025 doesn't buy you a whole lot, right? And yet the amount of money, the cost of maintaining 2% of your population incarcerated indefinitely is very high. I think that we heard the president say at one point that it costs $250 million a year. And that happens in the context of a country, a government who is in a serious financial crisis. They're implementing austerity measures under the pressure from the International Monetary Fund. They're firing teachers, medical personnel, closing schools. They're borrowing from the pensions.
You're saying making the entire country based off crypto didn't work?
It didn't work. The IMF said, please stop using the federal or the national reserves to buy crypto coins, right? So anyway, that's the financial context. There is a real financial need to make this prison system sustainable. I don't think he resolves that with $6 million. There are broader political motives and incentives for this deal, I would say. And the first one is this deep desire that President Bukele has to be seen as a model. I think you see that in the videos of the mega prison, that this is how strong men deal with the worst of the worst prisoners in the world, right? The Secot, the terrorist confinement center, it looks like these modern facilities, but the architecture itself is built to be brutal, to be cruel. And so I think the security strategy that I described, the state of exception, which is one that says that the emergency on the ground in El Salvador is so great that the only way to resolve this is by restricting the rights of all Salvadorans, overthrowing the democracy. President Bukele said that at the UN. He said, I couldn't have provided security to the Salvadoran people if I didn't overthrow the courts and the Attorney General. So that model of security, of sort of rights in exchange for security, needs legitimacy. He desperately wants to see it in the world as a model. And I think that's, from the Salvadoran perspective, one of the primary motives in this agreement. There's a secondary motive here, too, in that among the deportations of Venezuelans were 23 Salvadorans. And one of those Salvadorans is a leader of the principal gang in El Salvador, the Mara Salvatrucha. And he was being accused in a federal court in New York, together with 14 other leaders of the Mara Salvatrucha. And this was part of a big investigation coordinated by the Justice Department, actually started by President Trump in his first term, that led to an investigation of this gang from El Salvador, Mexico, and the United States. And part of that investigation highlights how the gangs exerted political influence in the Bukele government. And so in the indictment presented by the Attorney Generals of New York, it's very explicit. It says in very clear language that the gangs agreed with the Bukele government to create the perception of reduced homicide rates that benefited the president and his political party in 2 elections. In a sense, what the Attorney General is saying is the popularity of President Bukele, which is now very well known, was built around an agreement with gangs, groups that are being called terrorist groups now in the United States. And so it is pretty clear that the president of El Salvador would much rather have those people disappeared in a prison in El Salvador than talking in courts in the United States.
Nikki, with Trump and the sort of connection here between him and Bukele, Noah mentioned there how Bukele wants El Salvador to be seen as some sort of model. Has Trump just completely readily, was he looking for a model, did it feel like? And this is just so that makes this an almost perfect connection for the two of them. He clearly wants to sort of see someone show that, yeah, I've got to be this sort of person to make you all safe.
I mean, yes and no. I think Trump is taking a bit of a patchwork from various authoritarians and autocrats throughout the world, Bukele being one of them. You also have like Viktor Orban in Hungary. You have the Saudis. He likes a strong man. He very much gravitates to a specific model of politics. And I think Bukele embodies that quite well. I also, and Noah and I talked about this in our interview, what he's doing isn't necessarily a super new playbook. This idea of, as Noah put it in our discussion, creating an internal enemy, an enemy from within, and harnessing the forces of your state, the power of your government to target that enemy and erode other institutions that you claim are preventing you from dealing with that enemy. So it isn't just, Trump calling undocumented migrants terrorists and, deporting them to El Salvador and making this deal with Bukele and using crime as a cover for human rights abuses. It's also the reality that one of Trump's first actions when he was sworn in for his second term was to purge the Justice Department of prosecutors he thought were disloyal, fire pretty much everyone from the DOJ who prosecuted January 6 cases. It was him repealing security details for his political enemies, talking about how he was going to explore ways to reverse presidential pardons. It's him right now talking about impeaching judges who are saying like, hey, this isn't constitutional. You need to operate within the rule of law. There are checks and balances here. It's him appointing an unelected bureaucrat, an Elon Musk, to just purge large swaths of the federal government that not only give him more control over agencies and institutions in the U.S. government that traditionally have had some level of independence. And this isn't just the judiciary. This is oversight agencies, regulatory bodies. It's not just giving him control over that. It's also removing whole bodies of institutional knowledge that could mess with his plans going forward. It is the standard authoritarian playbook. You come in, you say, hey, these are the baddies.
Yeah.
And over here are our baddies who are stopping me from stopping them. So, Hamas is a foreign terrorist organization. That is now being used as the justification to round up green card holders and permanent residents, hold them indefinitely, move them around detention centers in the United States, and then deport them summarily to countries of origin where they may be in danger. Noah mentioned how Bukele had offered to take U.S. citizens into El Salvador's prison system. And Trump was asked about it over the weekend. And you know what his response was? I love that. I love that idea. What we're looking at isn't just something that's going to affect immigrants and undocumented people and green card holders. It is the establishment of an authoritarian framework that at the end of the day would allow Trump to do whatever he wants without opposition.
Noah, do you feel a bit of a sense of almost deja vu looking over to what's happening in America at the moment?
I couldn't even explain to you I was in New York last week actually, and everyone in the U.S., at least like kind of liberals in the U.S., are throwing their arms in the air, similar to what we're hearing from Nikki, right? And they're like, "But you're so calm." And I was like, "Yeah, well, we've been living with dictatorship for 6 years, and in my case, our organization's case, that has meant getting used to monitoring and espionage, systematic sort of defamation campaigns, administrative and legal attacks against us, the use of the police and the investigative parts of the government to harass our friends and people around us. We even have members on our staff whose elderly parents have been detained and held without trial for years. So like there's a lot of parallels. It's important for the United States, I think people in the United States, to be able to see themselves in this mirror. When we were talking with Nikki, I told her there's a phrase from a Salvadoran. He's one of our martyrs. But so this guy, he's a liberation theologian, and he was in charge of the UCA. He was killed in 1989 by the Salvadoran military. But he said that the third world to the first world is an inverted mirror, in which the first world looks and sees a distorted image of itself. And I think that people in the global north tend to think about the South as the place where there's poverty, where there's corruption, where there's human rights violations, where there's dictatorship. And in the United States specifically, this idea of being an exceptional nation makes it difficult for Americans to see how those things play out in their own context. And I think we could talk about all the ways that I see these parallels playing out. Nikki calls it the playbook. There's a method. There's a method for concentrating power. And in this recent deportation of Venezuelans, I think that we've seen this commonality across the board of using the idea that there are groups and individuals in a society who are fundamentally threats to that society and shouldn't be protected by law. And therefore, an executive or the president should be freed to do whatever it takes to neutralize that threat or those people, those groups. There's a judicial philosophy behind this. A German judicial philosopher named Gunther Jacobs, describing the Nazi judicial system, created this term called the criminal law of the enemy. And it's just what I just said. This idea that there are certain people who shouldn't fundamentally have rights in a society and should be treated as the leaders see fit. And that hasn't played well in history, but it's a really powerful narrative where you draw the parallels even with Palestine, this idea that there are groups of people who probably shouldn't be protected by international humanitarian law. The country should be freed from any limitations on the use of power in order to eliminate them. And all that sounds attractive to people when they're confronted with the threat. Our organization has spent the last 10 years assisting the victims of gang violence. We know the atrocities. We know the brutality. But the problem is, and that's what makes it seductive for people to say, no, you're right. We should sacrifice rights in exchange for security. Maybe we should even rethink the forms of government and the checks on power so that we could have a unique leader that can give us security. All that works until you realize that when the president's the one who gets to decide who has rights and who doesn't, sooner or later, you might be a part of that group. And you'll find yourself unprotected against the repressive power of the state. And that's been the primary experience in El Salvador, that realization.
How has Bukele managed to keep this going in the way he has? And in terms of the sort of political fallout and the feeling among citizens in the country, how has that shifted over time? And looking to America, how might this be, as crass as it sounds, be sort of politically short-sighted potentially for Donald Trump?
One of the other parallels that I would draw between El Salvador and the United States is this idea. You hear Donald Trump talking about his electoral victory being the proof that he is an expression of the will of the people. He is unique, has a unique mandate to do things, and that any institutions, norms, or standards that get in his way would be illegitimate, would be understood as obstructions of the will of the people. That's how Nayib Bukele has governed as well. He has been historically popular. He's had electoral victories. There is no political opposition parties, in effect, in El Salvador. The popularity of the president has been the source of his legitimacy. I think I told Nikki this. Consistently in public opinion polls, Nayib has like an 80% approval rating. But in those same polls, like 83% of the population says that they're afraid to express an opinion that's not aligned with the president or his party. So you have a Salvadoran population that says, yes, we support the president, but we're afraid to tell you if we don't. And I think that that's, one of those indicators of how public opinion in closed societies doesn't reflect a free will of the people. And so that's how he has sustained support for the strategy. There's a security result that people are grateful for. There's a loss of right that's felt acutely by everyone in the society now. Yet people are afraid to participate in the political system, to speak out critically, to dissent. This massive repressive apparatus that they've constructed in the state of exception, where the government can detain indefinitely whoever they want, creates an environment where everybody knows the government can do whatever it wants to whoever it wants. And there's no institution that can intervene to protect rights. And so there's a massive environment of fear.
Would you have any advice for people kind of coming to terms with living in this sort of environment, or people, in America who are feeling the weight of this? Or is it naive of me to ask or even suggest that there are maybe things that individuals can do to protect themselves from this? It's systemic, and unfortunately, the weight of this sort of thing, you can't really do very much to avoid it yourself.
Yeah, these in El Salvador, we use the word or this phrase we come up with called ensayos del dictador, and so they're like the rehearsals of the aspiring dictator.
Yeah.
These episodes, like the deportation of Venezuelans, they use crisis and emergency to expand the scope of executive power and normalize abuses. And in those processes, these rehearsals for autocracy, there's an abundance of pragmatism and very few democratic heroes. We need people to defend standards, to counter the normalization of the abuses and the concentration of power. And unfortunately, what I think we see in the United States and in El Salvador is too much pragmatism. I'll be safer if I keep my head down. I'll be safer if I align myself on these things. And in the end of the day, like what I've been trying to describe here is that the loss of rights for one group of people sooner or later affects the entire country. Rule of law is abstract. It'll never win an election until you need it, until all of a sudden your freedom and your life depend on due process and access to rule of law. And so I think, in short, people need to reject this. It's not about ideology. It's not about politics. Fundamentally, when a project is about altering the political system and tilting it towards autocracy, that's bad for human life. That's what history tells us. And we need to be able to say that. We need more people to be able to say that.
Noah, thank you so much for so eloquently getting into all of that. I really appreciate your time and the work you do. Thanks so much for joining us for American Friction.
My pleasure. Thank you for having me.
No, thank you so much, Noah.
Thank you as well, Nikki.
No, it was all Noah. When you guys said you wanted to talk about the article, I was just like, we need to have Noah on because there's really no feasible way to explain the severity of the situation without talking to people who are on the ground.
Yeah.
And growing up in Mexico, Noah and I talked about this. I worked with a small little corner of the prison system in Mexico when I was growing up in Guadalajara. And I think he's completely correct also in this idea that Americans have a really hard time conceptualizing erosion of institutions in their own backyard, but they also just don't know. Like, they only know their own justice system, and the American justice system is really fucked up, but I don't think Americans really have any idea of how bad it could be.
Yeah.
Prisons in El Salvador, prisons in Mexico have been awful for decades. For it to be this much worse with this much impunity, it's just... Anyway, I'm rambling now. But yeah.
No, you're allowed to ramble, Nikki. Thanks very much.
I always ramble.
As
That's what I
always.
do on this show.
And all of you listening to American Friction, thank you so much for your support. Remember, if you want to help us keep going and help us having these sort of conversations with people such as Noah, you can back us on Patreon. Go to patreon.com/American Friction. I'm Jacob Jarvis. Thank you very much for joining us.